Excellencies, colleagues, we will now begin the interactive dialogue on the written update of the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights on the situation of human rights in Sri Lanka, as mandated in the Council Resolution 51/1. The list of speakers will close in 15 minutes, and it's my pleasure and honor to welcome Ms. Nada Al-Nashif, Deputy High Commissioner for Human Rights. You have the floor, Madam.
Thank you very much, Mr. President, Your Excellencies, colleagues and friends. Pursuant to its Resolution 51/1 of October 2022, the Council has been presented with the written update of the High Commissioner on the situation of human rights in Sri Lanka. 1 year after the remarkable protest movement demanding deep political and democratic reforms, the transformation that was hoped for to address long-standing challenges has still not materialized. The country continues to deal with the aftermath of the deep economic crisis of 2022 and the current stresses in the global economy. Delays in holding local government elections and in reconstituting provincial councils under the 13th Amendment have limited people's right to political participation and the free expression of voters. While the economic crisis has significantly affected the enjoyment of rights of large segments of the population in Sri Lanka, it has impacted the poor and the marginalized communities the most. As the country's poverty rate has doubled from 13% in 2021 to 25% last year, in 2022, another 2.5 million people have been driven into poverty, and an estimated 37% of households face acute food insecurity. As the government implements its economic recovery policies, it should be guided by its obligations under the International Covenant on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights to protect the most vulnerable. The international community, including international financial institutions, should keep supporting Sri Lanka in its recovery in line with obligations around international cooperation and assistance by providing the fiscal space needed while pressing for genuine progress in governance, transparency and accountability. The economic hardship, the tensions around economic and structural reform policies, and the delay of local elections continue to give rise to protests. Land acquisition in the north and east for expansion of military installations, Buddhist heritage conservation at Hindu or Muslim sites, and forestry protection have also escalated tensions. Our office continues to receive cases of misuse of tear gas and water cannons during demonstrations, affecting protesters and media personnel. Initiatives by victims to memorialize their loved ones have also been obstructed. These measures restricting the right to protest will only generate more tension in the country as they prevent people from expressing their grievances and engaging in critical debate. It is imperative that the government ensures an environment that respects free expression, peaceful assembly, and democratic space as the basis for reconciliation and social cohesion. The report provides an analysis of concerns with some forthcoming legislation, in particular the proposed anti-terrorism bill that will replace the Prevention of Terrorism Act and a new law to regulate media broadcasting. It urges a moratorium on the use of the PTA in the meantime and for the review of long-standing PTA cases to be expedited. 14 years since the war ended, tens of thousands of victims and their families continue to suffer in agony and grief as they await truth, justice, and remedy. The report recognizes the initiatives of the government to advance reconciliation, including its proposal for a new truth-seeking mechanism. However, it also stresses that urgent confidence-building steps are needed to create an environment in which a genuine reconciliation and transitional justice processes can succeed. These include meaningful and transparent consultations with victims and civil society on the current truth-seeking proposal, and an end to all forms of harassment and unlawful and arbitrary surveillance against human rights defenders and victims groups, as well as support for initiatives to acknowledge and memorialize the experience of victims. Truth-seeking alone will not be sufficient and must be accompanied by a clear commitment to accountability, including through an independent ad hoc special court. The report recommends that the government accelerate investigations and prosecutions in emblematic cases of human rights violations, including the Easter Sunday bombings, in compliance with international human rights standards. The High Commissioner has repeatedly recommended that the government of Sri Lanka should establish a follow-up, independent and transparent investigation into the Easter Sunday attacks with international assistance and the full participation of victims and their representatives. Mr. President, Your Excellencies, while noting the government's rejection of resolutions 46/1 and 51/1, the report also updates on the work of the Accountability Project established by our office to collect, consolidate, analyze, and preserve relevant information and evidence and provide support to relevant judicial and other proceedings, including those in member states with competent jurisdiction. The project is receiving a steady increase in requests from competent state authorities, including in relation to 10 named individuals to date. The project has made significant progress in developing a repository of information and evidence, and based on identifying gaps and priorities for further investigation. It is also actively engaging with civil society, including victims' representatives. Accountability is central to secure Sri Lanka's present and its future. While it remains the obligation of the Sri Lankan authorities to acknowledge past violations and undertake credible accountability measures, this Council and the Member States can play an important and complementary role in advancing accountability. My office remains committed to supporting the government and the people of Sri Lanka in advancing reconciliation and accountability, as well as the full enjoyment of human rights. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you, Madam Deputy High Commissioner. Now we will hear from the delegation of country concerned. So let me give the floor to the representative of Sri Lanka. You have 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. President. At the outset, let me reiterate that the government of Sri Lanka has consistently rejected resolutions 46/1 and 51/1 that led to the setting up of the so-called Accountability Project. We also reject the written update, its conclusions, and recommendations. We recall that the majority of member states either opposed or abstained from voting on these resolutions in fundamental disagreement with their unacceptable content, in particular the so-called evidence-gathering mechanism, the establishment of which is unprecedented. We reiterate that it goes beyond the mandate that member states conferred on the Council by UNGA Resolution 60/251. Mr. President, these resolutions are intrusive and polarizing and upheld only by a handful of countries for reasons unrelated to human rights and based on their vote bank domestic politics. Many countries have raised serious concerns on the budgetary implications of this resolution, given its dubious mandate. Sri Lanka has repeatedly pointed out that this is an unproductive and unhelpful drain on the resources of the Council and its members. Therefore, Sri Lanka will not cooperate with it. However, as an active participant of the multilateral framework and in keeping with our close engagement with the international community and the Council in other areas of its work, Sri Lanka will continue to engage constructively with other mechanisms of the Council that have been productive and beneficial to our people, such as the UPR process. The content of the written update does not reflect the actual situation in Sri Lanka. The economic, social, and financial stabilization Sri Lanka has achieved in the past year has been appreciated and acknowledged domestically and externally. Those who are mandated and have the expertise to deal with economic and financial reforms remain confident in the country's prospects. It is also regrettable that the OHCHR has chosen to ignore the democratic resilience of the country and its institutions demonstrated in the past year. Sri Lanka is deeply concerned at the ever-increasing mandate of the OHCHR in making sweeping and intrusive comments on all aspects of economic, financial, electoral, political, domestic, budgetary, and development policies. We strongly object to pronouncements on policy matters that are essentially domestic for any sovereign country and outside the framework of this Council. In its simplistic analysis, the OHCHR also refers to challenges Sri Lanka is facing in the food, health and nutrition and education sectors as if it is an isolated phenomenon affecting Sri Lanka alone. In New York, the UN Secretary General, in solidarity with developing countries in debt and financial distress arising from the current global context, is highlighting sympathetically the severe setbacks and challenges encountered by all developing countries in achieving the SDGs. Sri Lanka also rejects the references to targeted sanctions that are based on incorrect and unsubstantiated sources, contravening the principles of natural justice, of universality, impartiality, objectivity, and non-selectivity. Mr. President, Sri Lanka remains firmly committed to pursuing tangible progress on human rights through our domestic institutions and have made significant progress. In a statement to Parliament on 9th August this year, President Wickremesinghe outlined the government's vision and progress made in reconciliation efforts undertaken, inter alia in legislative reforms, institutional activities, land issues, resettlement, North and East development, and 13th Amendment. All-party conferences have been convened to consolidate political support for these efforts. The Anti-Corruption Act No. 9 of 2023 has strengthened the financial and functional independence of the Commission to investigate allegations of bribery and corruption. Deliberations continue on the draft anti-terrorism bill with the aim of bringing it in line with international standards. Tangible progress has been made by independent domestic mechanisms, inter alia the Office on Missing Persons, Office for Reparations, and Office for National Unity and Reconciliation, and details are provided in our written observations to the report. The Interim Secretariat for the Truth and Reconciliation Mechanism is established. The proposed mechanism has been identified as a meaningful way to secure the peace achieved after 3 decades of brutal conflict. Consultations are ongoing, including with civil society, on the proposed mechanism. The Office for Overseas Sri Lankan Affairs functions as a central point to engage with overseas Sri Lankans, promoting reconciliation through dialogue and understanding. Mr. President, we have provided our observations in detail to this written update to counter grave distortions in the document and its misrepresentation of the ground situation in Sri Lanka. We request that our response be given equal visibility as the OHCHR report. Notwithstanding our position on the HRC resolution, as a responsible member of the international community, Sri Lanka will continue to engage constructively with the UN in keeping with domestic priorities and policies, as well as the international obligations voluntarily undertaken. I would like to end by conveying Sri Lanka's sympathies to the people of Morocco at this difficult time. Thank you.
Thank you. And now let me open the floor for delegations. And the first one on my list is New Zealand.
Mr. President and Deputy High Commissioner, before I begin, let me convey the New Zealand government's sincere condolences to the government and people of Morocco for the tragedy and devastation of their earthquake. Aotearoa New Zealand thanks the Office of the High Commissioner for the report and welcomes the continued attention on and support offered to Sri Lanka. We welcome Sri Lanka's progress in stabilizing its economy following the country's acute economic crisis. We will continue to offer assistance as appropriate. As the recovery continues, we agree that economic reform measures should uphold the basic economic, social and cultural rights of Sri Lankans. Civil and political rights are also important of themselves and in supporting long-term economic prosperity. They provide people with avenues for offering ideas and expressing disagreement legitimately. We therefore urge Sri Lanka to promptly hold legally prescribed elections which are now overdue, while ensuring all future elections are scheduled in a timely manner according to the law, and to safeguard the fundamental freedoms of expression, peaceful assembly and association. New Zealand strongly supports reconciliation and accountability for human rights violations, with a victim-centric approach at the forefront of that work. We acknowledge Sri Lanka's recent focus on reconciliation, including the proposed establishment of a National Unity and Reconciliation Commission. While encouraging these efforts, we strongly urge greater participation of and increased consultation with affected communities in order to promote enduring peace and stability. Thank you.
Thank you. The European Union, you have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. President. The EU welcomes the OHCHR report. We reaffirm our commitment to human rights, reconciliation and accountability in Sri Lanka. While the EU recognizes the challenges Sri Lanka has been facing due to the economic and financial crisis throughout last year, we underline the need for upholding all human rights, including the rights to freedom of opinion, expression and assembly, as well as the effective and equal fulfillment of economic, social and cultural rights of all persons in Sri Lanka, including persons in vulnerable and marginalized situations. Recognizing the positive course of action over the past months, leading the country towards economic stabilization, the EU continues to call for reconciliation, accountability, and resolving the many cases of enforced disappearances. We take note of plans for reconciliation mechanisms and the President's dialogue with Tamil political parties, as well as the promise to stop land acquisitions for archaeological, forestry, or security purposes. However, these still need to be turned into concrete actions. The EU calls on Sri Lanka to enable the right of peaceful assembly and refrain from any use of force against peaceful demonstrators. We call upon Sri Lanka to suspend the Prevention of Terrorism Act until it is in full compliance with international human rights law and standards, and also call for accountability and immediate action to end impunity. The EU encourages the government of Sri Lanka to remain engaged with the UN and international partners and to fully cooperate with the High Commissioner. The EU will continue to support Sri Lanka's efforts towards a fully inclusive dialogue on governance, rule of law, democratic renewal, as well as human rights. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you. Colleagues, the list of speakers is now closed, and I'm inviting the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland.
This statement is by the Sri Lanka Core Group comprising Canada, North Macedonia, Malawi, Montenegro, the United Kingdom and the United States. Deputy High Commissioner, we welcome your report on Sri Lanka. Sri Lanka has made important recent commitments on land issues and devolution of political authority. We encourage Sri Lanka to turn these commitments into meaningful action and deliver long-awaited results. Sri Lanka still has a long way to go to fulfill commitments to justice, accountability and reconciliation. We note preparations for a Truth and Reconciliation Commission and emphasise the importance of an inclusive participatory process in the establishment of any mechanisms to advance transitional justice, to gain the confidence of all affected communities in line with international best practices. We are concerned by continued incidents of intimidation and harassment of civil society and journalists and by the arbitrary use of laws to suppress dissent. As Sri Lanka takes forward its economic recovery, we stress the importance of effective governance reforms and note the recent anti-corruption legislation. This must be accompanied by safeguarding established independent institutions and democratic processes. We call on Sri Lanka to work with the High Commissioner and his office and remain ready to support Sri Lanka in addressing HRC Resolution 51/1. Thank you.
Thank you. And now let me invite Oman.
شكرا يا سيد الرئيس. ألقي هذا البيان نيابة عن الدول الأعضاء في مجلس التعاون لدول الخليج العربية، ونود بداية أن نضم صوتنا بتقديم خالص التعازي للضحايا في المغرب الشقيق حكومة وشعبا. السيد الرئيس، تؤكد دول مجلس التعاون على دعمها للحوارات المفتوحة والفعالة بهدف تعزيز وتطوير ممارسات حقوق الإنسان. وقد أخذت دول مجلس التعاون علما بتقرير المفوض السامي لحقوق الإنسان حول سريلانكا، واطلعت باهتمام على جهود الحكومة السريلانكية لتعزيز المصالحة والمساءلة عن انتهاكات حقوق الإنسان، لا سيما المؤتمر العام الذي عقدته في ديسمبر 2022 ويناير 2023، وما نتج عنه من مخرجات إيجابية تصب في هدف تعزيز المصالحة والمساءلة. وفي هذا السياق تحث دول المجلس على ضرورة استمرار حكومة سريلانكا باتخاذ الخطوات اللازمة لضمان فعالية الحوار للوصول إلى المصالحة الوطنية التي تهدف إلى تحقيق الاستقرار وضمان اعتماد رؤية مشتركة لتعزيز حقوق الإنسان على أراضيها، وعلى أهمية دعم الجهود التي تقوم بها الحكومة عبر التعاون الفني وبناء القدرات في هذا المجال. السيد الرئيس، تؤكد دول المجلس على أن تعزيز حقوق الإنسان وحمايتها مسؤولية جماعية تتطلب عملا مكثفا وحوارا مشتركا في إطار الثقة والاحترام المتبادل والالتزام بمبادئ الحياد والموضوعية والتعاون الدائم لجهود الدول للوفاء بالتزاماتها في مجال حقوق الإنسان. وشكرا سيد الرئيس.
Thank you. Liechtenstein is the next.
First, I would like to also express my sincere condolences to the people of Morocco on the terrible losses caused by the recent earthquake. We thank the High Commissioner for the presentation of the report on human rights situation in Sri Lanka. We note the efforts made by the government towards justice, accountability and reconciliation, including the latest proposed National Unity and Reconciliation Commission. Nevertheless, past ad hoc bodies, such as the Office of Missing Persons, have failed to gather the support of victims and ensure accountability. Accountability is a crucial step towards sustainable peace, and in this regard, we are pleased to hear about progress made with the OHCHR's accountability project. At the same time, we urge the government of Sri Lanka to step up up its responsibility to undertake credible investigations and prosecutions of human rights violations. Moreover, we are concerned about the shrinking civic space, in particular the attacks on freedom of assembly, namely through arbitrary arrests of protesters and forceful crowd control measures, or harassment and intimidation, preventing people from protesting. We call on the government of Sri Lanka to ensure the rights of freedom of peaceful assembly as well as expression, and not to stop targeting journalists, and to stop targeting journalists and human rights defenders. I thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you. Now let me invite Egypt.
السيد الرئيس، يأخذ وفد مصر علما بتقرير المفوض السامي لحقوق الإنسان حول سريلانكا، ويؤكد وفد مصر أهمية الالتزام بمبادئ العالمية والموضوعية وعدم الانتقائية عند النظر في قضايا حقوق الإنسان في سريلانكا، والابتعاد عن تسييس حقوق الإنسان واستغلالها للتدخل في الشؤون الداخلية، مع أهمية إيلاء عناية ببناء قدرات المؤسسات الوطنية والتعاون الفني. كما يعيد وفد مصر التأكيد على أهمية مواصلة المجلس ومكتب المفوض السامي تعزيز الحوار والتنسيق مع سريلانكا، وذلك لضمان تحقيق مردود إيجابي وتقديم الدعم اللازم وفقا للأولويات الوطنية وفي ظل الاحترام الكامل لسيادتها. شكرا سيدي الرئيس.
Thank you. Luxembourg is the next.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. Le Luxembourg s'associe à la déclaration de l'Union européenne. Nous remercions la haut-commissaire adjointe pour son rapport, dont nous saluons les conclusions. Pour être juste et durable, la reprise après la grave crise économique au Sri Lanka doit s'accompagner de réformes institutionnelles et politiques profondes, ainsi que d'une rupture avec la culture d'impunité pour les violations et les abus des droits humains. Le rapport du Haut-Commissariat contient un vaste éventail de recommandations en matière de réforme de la justice, de protection contre la discrimination de minorités ethniques et religieuses ou encore de lutte contre la corruption. Le Luxembourg encourage vivement le Sri Lanka à mettre en œuvre ces recommandations. Nous sommes préoccupés par les atteintes aux droits civils et politiques, par l'absence de résultats tangibles dans la lutte contre l'impunité et par la militarisation de fonctions gouvernementales civiles. Les autorités devraient en outre s'abstenir de tout recours à la force contre les manifestants pacifiques et faire cesser toute intimidation contre les voix dissidentes. La loi sur la prévention du terrorisme devrait être amendée afin qu'elle soit pleinement conforme au droit international des droits humains. Pour conclure, Madame la haut-commissaire adjointe, quels sont les points de départ concrets les plus prometteurs pour le Sri Lanka et ses partenariats internationaux pour instaurer un dialogue national inclusif sur la gouvernance, l'état de droit, les valeurs démocratiques et les droits humains? Je vous remercie.
Merci à vous. Germany, you have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. President. First, I would like to express Germany's sincere condolences to the people of Morocco for the terrible losses caused by the earthquake. Germany aligns itself with the statement by the EU. We thank the Office of the High Commissioner for the report and welcome their work. As a co-author of last year's resolution, Germany reaffirms its commitment to fostering peace, reconciliation and respect for human rights in Sri Lanka. We stand with all people of the country in their quest for a better future. We recognize the burden the people of Sri Lanka are facing following the economic crisis, and we reaffirm our commitment to human rights, reconciliation and accountability in Sri Lanka, and commend recent initiatives for dialogue, as well as the suspension of land acquisition, in particular in the north of the country. However, lasting peace and stability can only be built on true accountability for the past and strong protection of human rights in the future. We therefore call on the government of Sri Lanka to implement meaningful steps for accountability and reconciliation. We take note in this regard of the President's initiative to form a truth finding mechanism to account for Sri Lanka's civil war. We continue to call on the government of Sri Lanka to repeal the Prevention of Terrorism Act to allow for reforms bringing the legal framework in compliance with international human rights obligations. Madam Deputy High Commissioner, how can the government of Sri Lanka improve cooperation with the UN human rights system to foster such a meaningful reconciliation? Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you. Maintenant, je passe la parole à la France.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. Monsieur le Président, la France s'associe à la déclaration de l'Union européenne et remercie le Haut-Commissariat pour son rapport. Depuis 2015, ce Conseil adopte une approche coopérative afin d'aider les autorités sri-lankaises à mettre un terme aux violations et abus des droits de l'homme documentés par les rapports successifs du Haut-Commissariat et assurer reconnaissance et réparation aux victimes. Comme vous le soulignez, la situation des droits de l'homme à Sri Lanka souffre en plus depuis plusieurs mois de la crise économique à laquelle est confronté le pays, avec des difficultés accrues d'accès à l'alimentation, aux soins de santé ou encore à l'éducation. La France salue les efforts déployés par les autorités du Sri Lanka pour ce qui est du redressement de l'économie. Elle encourage les autorités à poursuivre les efforts pour aboutir à un état de droit respectueux de la diversité de la population. Elle souligne la nécessité de poursuivre dans ce sens, dans l'intérêt de tous les Sri Lankais, en appelant en particulier les autorités du Sri Lanka à préserver les libertés d'expression et de réunion pacifique. La France appelle aussi le Sri Lanka à mettre pleinement à profit l'assistance du Haut-Commissariat des Nations Unies aux droits de l'homme, mise en place par le Conseil des droits de l'homme, pour les accompagner dans le cadre du processus de réconciliation nationale. Elle appelle enfin à maintenir le moratoire en vue de l'abolition de la peine de mort. Je vous remercie.
Merci à vous. Now let me invite the delegation of the United States of America.
Thank you, Mr. President. The United States appreciates the Council's continued attention to Sri Lanka and welcomes the High Commissioner's report. As it navigates its economic recovery, we recognize Sri Lanka's strengthened reforms, including anti-corruption legislation. We also welcome the government's release on bail of over 100 individuals held without trial under the Prevention of Terrorism Act. We commend initial progress on land returns. However, we must note our concerns about other land grabs in the north and east. We remain concerned about tensions at religious sites and minority communities, government pressure on civil society, and the absence of local elections since 2018. We encourage meaningful consultations in finalizing the Anti-Terrorism Act and hope these discussions help bring the law into alignment with international best practices. We urge Sri Lanka to ensure transitional justice institutions operate credibly and effectively. Reconciliation initiatives should be victim-centered, inclusive, impartial, transparent, and independent. Governments that ensure freedom of expression and peaceful protests enjoy greater peace and stability. How can we best support the Sri Lankan government and people to develop a credible reconciliation process and pursue accountability? I thank you.
Thank you. And now let me invite Japan.
Mr. President and Madam Deputy High Commissioner for your briefings. Japan takes note of the Deputy High Commissioner's report and appreciates Sri Lanka's engagement in its preparation. Japan believes it's vital for Sri Lanka to take further voluntary actions and provide remedies to achieve a meaningful reconciliation and to improve its human rights situation through dialogue with all domestic and international stakeholders, including OHCHR. In this regard, Japan acknowledged the amendment to the Prevention of Terrorism Act as an important initial step and encourages Sri Lanka's further efforts to impose a moratorium on the PTA and enact fair and comprehensive counter-terrorism legislation. Japan supports Sri Lanka's efforts to establish a transnational justice mechanism, including the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, and recommends the Commission to effectively respond to the will of the Sri Lanka's people. Japan will continue to support Sri Lanka on both the human rights and the economic fronts, including through its ongoing capacity building assistance in the area of justice. I thank you.
Thank you. And the next speaker on my list is Israel.
Thank you, Mr. President. First of all, let me start by expressing solidarity with the people and government of Morocco following the devastating earthquake. Israel extends its deepest sympathy to the grieving families, prays for the injured, and is ready to assist as needed. Mr. President, Israel takes note of the High Commissioner's report on Sri Lanka. Israel is concerned by the severe economic crisis that hit Sri Lanka in 2022, which significantly impacted the enjoyment of rights. Israel welcomes the news that the economy has appeared to stabilise in 2023 and that shortages in fuel, electricity, food, medicines and other essentials has been partly alleviated. That being said, food insecurity remains a major barrier to the enjoyment of human rights. It's essential that underlying factors of the economic crisis are addressed, including corruption, centralisation of power, lack of transparency and the unresolved legacy of conflict. All necessary measures should be taken to guarantee people economic and social rights during this economic crisis. Mr. President, in addition to this, Israel calls for all cases of enforced disappearances and mass graves to be fully investigated, and for the right to freedom and of expression and assembly to be guaranteed, and welcomes steps taken in this regard. I thank you.
Thank you. And now let me invite Switzerland.
Monsieur le Président, la Suisse remercie le Haut-Commissaire pour son rapport sur la situation au Sri Lanka. Nous saluons les efforts du gouvernement au sujet de la réconciliation et des réformes pour renforcer l'état de droit. Nous l'encourageons à mener un processus de justice transitionnelle qui soit inclusif, centré sur les victimes, transparent et qui respecte les standards internationaux. La recherche sur la vérité ne suffira pas à elle seule. Elle doit s'accompagner d'un engagement en faveur de la reddition des comptes et d'une volonté politique de mettre en œuvre des changements profonds. Ce processus ne peut pas non plus exclure des progrès réels en matière de justice. Par conséquent, la Suisse exhorte les autorités sri-lankaises à coopérer avec le Sri Lanka Accountability Project. La Suisse est préoccupée par l'utilisation abusive de la loi sur la promotion du terrorisme de 1979 et de la loi sur le pacte international relatif aux droits civils et politiques qui ne répondent pas à la résolution 51.1 du Conseil. Nous notons avec inquiétude qu'elles servent à réprimer les droits à la liberté d'expression et à mener des arrestations arbitraires des voix dissidentes. Elle facilite aussi le recours excessif à la force et aux ordonnances judiciaires préventives à l'encontre des manifestants. Madame la Haut-Commissaire adjointe, la Suisse se tient prête à faciliter les plateformes de dialogue pour le processus de réconciliation au Sri Lanka. Je vous remercie.
Merci à vous. Turkey, you have the floor.
Mr. President, we take note of the active and constructive participation of Sri Lanka in the regular United Nations human rights mechanisms. A large part of the Sri Lankan population, especially the most vulnerable groups, including children, are still deeply affected by the economic crisis. The report also highlights these difficult conditions. Sri Lankan society has clearly demonstrated its desire to build a prosperous and peaceful country through demonstrations organized by large groups from diverse backgrounds. We are pleased to see a series of significant reforms, not only in the economic sector, but also in the areas of governance, the legal system, and social welfare. We welcome the steps taken to advance the reconciliation process, establishment of the Constitutional Council, and to improve the independence of both Human Rights Commission as well as the Election Commission. We also appreciate the adoption of the new anti-corruption and anti-terrorism legislation in line with the international standards, promotion of women's rights, and strengthening of accountability measures. We hope that these reforms will pave the way to achieve stability in the economic, political, and social systems in the country. We believe that these reforms should be inclusive and encourage all ethnic and religious groups that make up the Sri Lankan society to work together. Sri Lanka's efforts should be supported in a constructive manner by this international community. Thank you.
Thank you. The next speaker on my list is Canada.
Thank you, Deputy High Commissioner, for the update. Mr. President, Canada remains concerned by persistent violations of human rights and freedoms in Sri Lanka. We welcome Sri Lanka's positive engagement with the UPR process in January and encourage Sri Lanka to use the current period of reform to implement constructive changes that advance inclusive governance, including support for the rights of ethnic and religious minorities. Canada continues to stress the importance of inclusive transitional justice that includes a focus on accountability for human rights violations, an end to impunity, and a commitment to reconciliation. We encourage Sri Lanka to adopt a proactive and transparent approach to investigating the recently discovered suspected mass grave site in Kokotho Divai. Canada will continue to support the people of Sri Lanka as they exercise their rights of freedom of peaceful assembly, association, and expression, and we urge Sri Lanka to uphold these rights. We acknowledge that Sri Lanka is developing legislation to replace the PTA and urge Sri Lanka to ensure the legislation is consistent with its international human rights commitments. While encouraged by the Supreme Court's decision that paves the way for Sri Lanka to decriminalize consensual same-sex relations, Canada remains concerned that relevant sections of the Penal Code unjustly target same-sex couples and calls on Sri Lanka to repeal these harmful sections. Madam Deputy High Commissioner, how can the OHCHR and the international community play a constructive role in helping Sri Lanka concretely advance peace-building, reconciliation, and accountability? Thank you.
Thank you. And the last speaker I'll be able to accommodate is Cuba.
Muchas gracias, señor presidente. La cooperación y el diálogo respetuoso sobre la base de los principios de la Carta de las Naciones Unidas constituyen el único camino a seguir para garantizar la promoción y protección efectiva de los derechos humanos. La resolución que da origen a este diálogo no cuenta con el apoyo del país concernido. Cualquier acción o mandato que de ella se derive será contraproducente, como lo han sido la mayoría de los mecanismos punitivos aprobados por este Consejo. Mecanismos de este tipo solo atizan la politización y la proliferación de los dobles raseros que se han impuesto en el Consejo y no contribuyen en modo alguno a la promoción y protección de los derechos humanos en el país. Señor presidente, en lugar de mecanismos de esta naturaleza, el Consejo debe privilegiar la genuina cooperación con la Oficina del Alto Comisionado sobre la base del respeto mutuo, así como el empleo de mecanismos universales como el examen periódico universal como única garantía para abordar de manera justa y no selectiva las cuestiones de derechos humanos en todos los países. Cuba continuará defendiendo estos principios en todos los órganos intergubernamentales pertinentes, particularmente en el Consejo de Derechos Humanos. Muchas gracias.